The dining room was suffocating. My mother-in-law, Barbara, smiled as she slid a sealed envelope across the mahogany table toward my husband, Ryan. "I think you need to see this," she said. It was an unauthorized DNA test for our 4-year-old daughter. The silence in the room sharpened. I did not flinch. I did not blink. Before I reveal exactly how I dismantled her entire life, leave a comment below and tell me, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it where you are? I would love to know about our community. I had known about the envelope for 14 days. 2 weeks earlier, I had walked into Barbara's study to drop off a mail delivery and noticed a printed receipt sitting carelessly on her antique desk. It was an order confirmation for a discreet genetic testing service, specifically requesting a paternity analysis using hair samples. The target was my 4-year-old daughter. Most people would have panicked. Most would have confronted their mother-in-law, demanding answers, crying about the violation of trust. I did not cry. I did not ask why. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. I simply pulled out my phone, photographed the document, and set it exactly back where I found it. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret for the family I thought we had, but there was only absolute clarity. This was not a betrayal to weep over. It was a balance sheet, and Barbara's account was heavily overdrawn. For 4 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. I had paid my dues in forced smiles at Sunday dinners, politely ignoring the subtle jabs about my career as a public school teacher. Now I realized it had been a subscription, with me footing the bill for their entertainment. So I opened my laptop and started clicking cancel. Over the next 14 days, I did not confront my husband. I did not start a fight. I prepared. I methodically assembled a legal defense strategy, gathering every piece of financial and personal documentation I could legally access within the household. I watched Barbara closely during those 2 weeks. I watched her play the doting grandmother, bringing gifts for my daughter while secretly plotting to destroy my marriage. Every interaction with Barbara over those 14 days was logged and filed in my mind. When she offered me tea, I noted the smugness. When she praised Ryan's business acumen, I calculated the leverage she thought she held. She operated under the assumption that she held a monopoly on control. I was simply preparing the antitrust lawsuit. My emotional divestment was instantaneous. The moment I saw that DNA test receipt, the mother-in-law I knew ceased to exist, replaced by a hostile corporate entity. You do not negotiate with hostile entities, you liquidate them. As I sat at that mahogany table, watching the envelope slide toward Ryan, I felt nothing but a cold, transactional satisfaction. I watched the trap close in complete silence, perfectly comfortable in the knowledge that it had been neutralized 2 weeks prior. The envelope was a loaded weapon, but I had already removed the firing pin. Barbara leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on me, waiting for the breakdown. She wanted tears. She wanted me to beg. She wanted the power of watching me crumble before the Atwood family tribunal. But they were not shocked by what she had done. They were going to be shocked that I had stopped playing along. My retaliation was not a future concept. It was already in motion, precise and inevitable. Barbara did not stop at unauthorized genetic testing. Her campaign was a diversified portfolio of sabotage. 3 days after I found the receipt, my school principal called me into his office. Barbara had anonymously contacted the school board, lodging a formal complaint that I was psychologically unstable and unfit to manage a classroom of children. She had meticulously fabricated a narrative of erratic behavior, suggesting my presence was a liability to the district. It was a calculated attempt to sever my primary source of independence. When I arrived at the Atwood estate for our mandatory family gathering later that week, the atmosphere was suffocatingly smug. My sister-in-law, Stephanie, sat on the velvet sofa, swirling a mimosa and offering backhanded sympathy. She loudly wondered how I managed the stress of teaching, adding that I had been looking incredibly exhausted lately. She was probing for weakness, hoping to validate her mother's narrative. I offered her a polite, vacant smile, refusing to supply the emotional reaction they demanded. This was the trap of cruel normalization. In the Atwood family, Barbara's viciousness was consistently rebranded as grandmotherly concern or fierce protectiveness. They had spent decades building an ecosystem where toxicity was simply the cost of doing business with their wealth. When Barbara destroyed someone's reputation, the family nodded and agreed that she was only maintaining their standards. When she humiliated a relative, it was justified as tough love. They were all complicit, bound together by the financial comfort she provided. They normalized the unacceptable because confronting it would mean risking their inheritance. I refused to be a casualty of their collective delusion. I watched them sip their champagne, reinforcing each other's terrible behavior, and I felt a profound sense of detachment. They thought they were breaking me down, wearing away my resilience until I would quietly surrender my marriage and my child. They mistook my silence for submission. I was simply gathering evidence. The school board complaint was not a crisis. It was another exhibit for my legal file. I contacted my union representative, provided my impeccable performance evaluations, and filed a counter-report for targeted harassment. I documented Stephanie's taunts and Barbara's thinly veiled threats. This was not revenge. It was accounting. I was compiling the ledger of their moral bankruptcy. Barbara believed her wealth insulated her from consequences. She believed the rules did not apply to the Atwood name. But I was not playing by Atwood rules. I was playing by the laws of decisive retaliation. Every strike she launched only sharpened my focus. Every lie she told only strengthened the case I was building. She was investing heavily in a market that was about to crash. I let her buy as many shares of her own deceit as she wanted. The higher she climbed, the more devastating the margin call would be. By the time Sunday dinner arrived, her escalation had reached its peak, completely unaware of the cliff she was about to walk over. The counter-strike required professional execution. 2 days after the school board incident, I sat in the sterile, glass-walled office of a premier family law and financial litigation attorney. We did not waste time discussing feelings. We looked at the data. Invalidating the unauthorized DNA test was a minor administrative task. The chain of custody was non-existent. The acquisition of the sample was legally dubious, and the laboratory was easily shut down with a single, aggressive cease and desist letter. But the DNA test was merely the symptom. I wanted the disease. I authorized my attorney to conduct a comprehensive forensic audit of the Atwood family finances, utilizing the access I had as Ryan's legal spouse. What we uncovered over the next 72 hours was not just leverage. It was a total systemic collapse. The Atwood wealth, the imposing estate, the designer wardrobes, and the endless charity galas were entirely subsidized by fraud. Barbara had been quietly, systematically embezzling money from Ryan's own generational trust fund. She had drained hundreds of thousands of dollars meant for his future to maintain her facade of high society dominance. Sitting in that office, reviewing the bank transfers and dummy accounts, I experienced the silent regret of the watcher. I had spent 4 years observing the subtle inconsistencies in Barbara's behavior. The sudden panics over minor expenses, the fierce guarding of the mail, the obsessive control over Ryan's financial portfolios. I regretted not connecting the data points sooner. The clues had always been there, hidden beneath layers of arrogance and silk. My observational skills had been sharp, but I had applied them to surviving the family dynamics rather than dismantling them. Now, that regret crystallized into absolute, uncompromising resolve. My strategic vision widened. This was no longer just about protecting my daughter from a fake paternity scandal. It was about exposing a parasite. Barbara was not the matriarch of an empire. She was a thief, operating a Ponzi scheme with her own son's legacy. When the lawyer asked how I wanted to proceed, I did not hesitate. I requested everything bound in a single, undeniable dossier. Bank statements, forged signatures, unauthorized wire transfers, and the hollowed-out trust fund records. I wanted the balance sheet of her betrayal printed in crisp black ink. I left the lawyer's office with a leather-bound folder that felt heavier than a stone. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. Barbara was still busy planting petty rumors and arranging fake DNA tests, entirely oblivious to the fact that her financial life support had just been unplugged. I had the ledger, and I was going to collect the debt in full. The drive home was quiet. I did not feel a rush of adrenaline or a surge of triumphant joy. I felt the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a completed equation. 2 + 2 finally equaled 4. Barbara's power was an illusion, financed by the very son she was trying to manipulate into leaving me. She had purchased her throne with stolen coin. I reviewed the strategy in my head, refining the timeline. There would be no early warnings, no ultimatums. A hostile takeover requires the element of complete surprise. I would let her set the stage for her own destruction. The financial audit yielded one final, devastating anomaly. Buried deep within the wire transfers was a recurring monthly payment to an encrypted account under the name James M. It was a small, consistent bleed that had been occurring for over 4 decades. I instructed the investigative team to pull on that specific thread. I expected to find a blackmailer, a secret lover, or an offshore tax haven. I did not expect to find a grave. The investigation unraveled a lie so profound it rewrote 40 years of history. Barbara was not an Atwood by birth, nor was she a legitimate member of the elite class she ruled over. The real Barbara Atwood had died in a tragic, undocumented accident 4 decades ago. The woman sitting in the matriarch's chair, the woman who tormented me and stole from my husband, was an imposter. Her real name was Martha, a former associate who had seamlessly assumed the identity of the deceased heiress before the estate could be properly settled. She had stolen a life, a name, and an entire fortune, paying off James M., a distant relative who knew the truth, to buy his permanent silence. The revelation was staggering, but my reaction remained entirely analytical. There was no shock, only the satisfying snap of the final puzzle piece locking into place. This explained everything. It explained her desperate need to control the family wealth, her terror of outside scrutiny, and her vicious attempts to push me away when she sensed I was not easily manipulated. I was a variable she could not control, and to a fraud, uncontrollable variables are fatal. I stared at the heavily documented background report, tracing the timeline of her 40-year deception. She had built an empire on a stolen birth certificate. She had married into society, raised children, and played the aristocrat, all while hiding a criminal past. Her entire existence was a copyright infringement. The unauthorized DNA test she had ordered for my daughter was suddenly dripping with supreme irony. A woman living under a stolen identity was demanding genetic proof of my child's lineage. I added the identity theft dossier to the back of the leather-bound folder. The weapon was now fully loaded, calibrated, and ready to fire. The Atwood family dinner was approaching, and the stage was set for a spectacular liquidation. I instructed the legal team to prepare the necessary documentation for local authorities, but to hold the filing until I gave the signal. This was not just a legal matter. It was a necessary demolition of a fraudulent institution. She had judged me for my modest background, sneered at my teacher's salary, and deemed my bloodline unworthy of her stolen crest. The audacity of her arrogance was a debt that could only be paid in absolute exposure. I closed the file, feeling the cold weight of absolute certainty. The impostor's reign was over, which brought us back to the suffocatingly formal Sunday dinner. The crystal glasses gleamed, the silence stretched. The envelope sat in the center of the mahogany table, Barbara's final, desperate play. "I think you need to see this," she repeated, her voice dripping with manufactured pity. She turned to Ryan, her eyes wide with fake maternal concern. "It is about your daughter. It is a DNA test, Ryan. You have a right to know the truth about your wife's indiscretions." Stephanie gasped right on cue. The rest of the family leaned in, practically vibrating with the anticipation of my demise. They waited for my tears. They waited for Ryan to scream, to throw me out of the estate, to validate their inherent superiority. Ryan looked at the envelope. Then he looked at me. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. 30 minutes before this dinner, in the quiet of our car, I had handed Ryan the leather-bound folder. I did not soften the blow. I did not offer a shoulder to cry on. I laid out the financial audit, the embezzlement, and the 40-year identity theft with clinical precision. I showed him the bank transfers draining his trust fund and the death certificate of the real Barbara Atwood. I gave him the truth, cold and unvarnished. He had read the documents in silence, his world collapsing and rebuilding itself in the span of a half-hour commute. Now, sitting at the head of the table, Ryan did not reach for Barbara's envelope. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out the thick, leather-bound dossier. He placed it directly on top of the DNA test. "I already have the truth," Ryan said, his voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "But I do not think you are going to like it, Martha." Barbara's face froze. The smug, aristocratic mask cracked, revealing the terrified imposter underneath. The use of her real name struck her like a physical blow. Ryan opened the dossier. He did not yell. He executed the transaction. He began to read aloud. He read the summary of the depleted trust fund, listing the exact dates and amounts stolen from his future to pay for her country club memberships. Stephanie tried to interject, but Ryan silenced her with a look. Then he turned to the final page. He detailed the identity theft, the payments to James M., and the 40-year fraud that constituted her entire existence. The power reversal was absolute and instantaneous. They were not shocked by my supposed infidelity. They were paralyzed by the realization that their matriarch was a criminal. Barbara's carefully constructed empire dissolved into dust before the first course was even served. She tried to speak, to deny it, but her mouth only opened and closed soundlessly. The confidence, the arrogance, the vicious superiority, it all shattered into a million irrecoverable pieces. I sat perfectly still, sipping my water. This was not a breakdown. It was an eviction. The Atwood family had just been foreclosed upon. The silence that followed Ryan's reading was absolute. It was the sound of a 40-year lie meeting its terminal end. No one rushed to comfort her. No one offered excuses. The financial reality of her crimes was undeniable, printed in black and white for the entire board of directors to see. I looked at the woman who had tormented me, who had tried to steal my daughter's rightful place, and I felt nothing but a cold, clinical finality. The transaction was complete. The account was closed. The aftermath was swift, relentless, and uncompromising. We did not stay for dessert. We walked out of the dining room that night and never set foot on the property again. Within 48 hours, the comprehensive legal dossiers were formally filed with local law enforcement and federal authorities. Barbara, or rather Martha, was permanently evicted from the Atwood estate by the remaining legal executors of the family trust. She was immediately entangled in a massive, inescapable web of criminal fraud investigations, severe identity theft charges, and massive civil suits aimed at recovering the decades of embezzled generational wealth. The woman, who had obsessed over high society status and aristocratic bloodlines, was swiftly reduced to a criminal defendant, her face and real name dragged through the public court records she had spent 4 decades desperately hiding from. Ryan executed his own exit strategy with surgical precision. He cleanly severed all business, personal, and financial ties with the Atwood estate. He liquidated his remaining legitimate shares and transferred his assets into secure, independent trusts specifically designed for our daughter. We did not demand apologies from Stephanie or the rest of the complicit relatives who had sat at that table waiting for my downfall. We simply cut the cord. The toxic subscription was permanently cancelled. We moved forward, leaving the smoking wreckage of their manufactured dynasty entirely behind us. We bought a modest, beautiful home, miles away from the country clubs, the forced Sunday dinners, and the endless deceit. We focused on building a life rooted in absolute transparency and mutual respect. We discovered that when you surgically remove a malignant force from your ecosystem, the space it leaves behind fills with extraordinary peace. Truth, no matter how cold or difficult to process initially, is the only sustainable foundation for a life worth living. I've come to realize that surviving a toxic family dynamic is rarely about fighting loudly or begging for understanding. It is about observing quietly, acting decisively, and absolutely refusing to internalize the poison they try to feed you. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But true forgiveness does not require maintaining contact, and it certainly does not require subjecting yourself to continuous abuse. Leaving a family is a mourning process, even when that family was harmful. Ryan and I spent months navigating the emotional fallout, untangling the knots of manipulation that Martha had tied so tightly around his life. We learned to communicate without defensive walls, to trust without verifying, and to love without conditions. Our daughter will grow up knowing only the safety of a home where she is cherished for exactly who she is, not what she represents to a fake legacy. We broke the cycle, and that is the greatest inheritance we could ever leave her. To anyone listening right now who has ever felt like an outsider in their own family, who has been mocked, diminished, or made to feel unworthy by the very people who should protect them, this is for you. I know the profound, suffocating isolation of sitting at a dinner table surrounded by individuals who view your presence as a burden. I know the bone-deep exhaustion of trying to prove your fundamental worth to people who have actively committed to misunderstanding you. You are not broken because you do not fit neatly into their broken system. You are not the problem simply because you refuse to normalize their cruelty. Your worth is not a fluctuating stock price that they get to manipulate. You do not need their permission to draw a hard, uncompromising line in the sand, and you absolutely do not need their validation to build a beautiful, successful life entirely without them. Sometimes, the most powerful, a liberating thing you can do is simply stop participating in their game, pack up your dignity, audit your own immense value, and walk out the door. The profound peace that waits on the other side of that threshold is worth every single moment of the difficult transition. You deserve a life built on solid truth, not a fragile performance built on fear. If you have ever had to stand firm against a toxic relative, share your story in the comments section. If this story helped you feel less alone, please hit like and share it with someone who needs to hear this today.